Aaron Tattersall here with another episode of At the Table with AgRisk Advisors, where we discuss timely and relevant issues challenging the ranchers and farmers we serve every day. You'll be hearing from industry experts and our advisors as we examine risk management programs to protect your legacy. Well, here we are once again at the table with AgRisk, and it's just a privilege to have Brian Bledsoe stop by and talk about just things we talk about. We're good friends with Brian, but the weather always seems to come up for some reason.
For some reason, yeah. People want to know what's going on with that.
Yeah.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, and obviously as we're getting tuned up as we head toward PRF season and the upcoming winter, and even into folks looking into 24, it's always a time to where we like to visit and hash things out and get ready to roll.
Yeah. You've been busy this year. I've noticed a lot more emails coming out from you.
It's been crazy. I mean, it's stuff that we figured it was going to happen this spring and summer, but when you go from the last few years to where the storm season has basically been nothing to where we're literally having storms every afternoon, and not just storms, but like high-end stuff, that's doing damage, whether it's hail or flash flooding, or, we've even had our fair share of tornadoes here, not only in Colorado, but across, a large part of the area. Yeah, it's been busy. I'm anxious for a little bit of downtime. Yeah.
Well, we're sitting here, this is August the 23rd, and in the PRF world, that's an interval for July, August, and August, September, and we've seen, I don't know, they call it a tropical storm Hillary or Hurricane Hillary?
Well, it was a high-end hurricane off the Baja. Water temperatures are warm down there, and when it got going, and then if you go farther north, those water temperatures cool off pretty rapidly, which is one of the main reasons why we rarely ever have anything tropical hit California. Gotcha. That cool water really kind of, helps to diminish those types of storms. But if you get something high-end like what Hillary was, which for a time was a pretty strong Cat 4, it has to take a little bit of time to wind down. So it basically made landfall as a tropical storm, threw up a bunch of rain in Southern California. But again, if you were not necessarily in that track as far as rain went, again, it's one of those haves and have-nots types of a thing. A lot of folks got some rain, some folks got some good rain, but not everybody got good rain. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. The last couple of weeks, been talking with producers across the West, and everyone's very thankful for the rain, but it'd just be nice to have a little bit of a break, to get some work done and things like that.
So. And I think that's what we've seen here in Colorado, especially, where it was just storm after storm after storm, and then we got a little bit of a break, getting some downtime, and then we're going to fire up some rain again this weekend, not just for Colorado, but for the region. In fact, that rain chance this upcoming weekend and early next week is actually going to be some of the remnants of what was Tropical Storm Harold, who hit South Texas yesterday. So that'll kind of pivot up through, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and then move into a large part of Colorado, and Colorado was starting to get a little crispy. You have all that rain and you grow all that stuff up, and then you heat it up and dry it out. You go right from what was flooding and hail to you have to worry about grassland fire danger because your grass is 3 feet tall out there.
There's a lot of fuel.
Yeah, there's a lot of fuel out there. Yeah. So, yeah, it's I'm glad to see the pattern change where some rain's coming back in.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I wanted to just discuss today, especially as we're ramping up for this late summer and fall, is just maybe we could just step back and look at where we were this time, I don't know, last October, November, what the forecasts were back then, and just proceed from there about what happened and what I know for me it's easy, and learning more and more about La Nina, El Nino, and kind of in general what that means, but I know there's nuances and things like that kind of get thrown in the mix too when it actually occurs.
Oh no, absolutely. I think last year at this time we were looking at what would have been the third winter of dealing with La Nina, and we'll just pluck California off for a great example of this, where 8 out of every 10 years that there's a La Nina, California, for the most part, struggles with drought. All right, well, rewind to last year, they had like record snow across pretty much the whole state. So
in
wet.
January.
Oh my goodness, yeah. It got started in December, mid-December, and then just blasted right on through. Yep. And I think that is an amazing example of when I tell folks when they just want to blanket something. It's like, well, it's a La Nina this year, so it's going to be this,
Sure.
or it's an El Nino, it's going to be this. It's a very important time to remind folks that every El Nino and La Nina are different. There are always unexpected outcomes or impacts that arrive from those types of things. So even if you get it generally right, someone's usually going to be way out of bounds here, as far, and California is a great example of that. But if you move further east, New Mexico was crazy dry. Eastern Colorado, once you got south of I-70, was crazy dry. North of I-70, they did just fine. They had a pretty solid winter up there, even up into Nebraska and whatnot. Western Kansas, the south, once you get south of 70, was dry. The Panhandle's crazy dry. So that was very on brand for a La Nina versus the big contrast of California out to the west, which had more snow than they knew what to do with at that time. Yeah. So I think that's a really important message when someone's just looking at that, to say you always have to be prepared for those little nuances or these quirks that happen with these types of things.
Mm-hmm. So when did this La Nina officially end, or when would you say, was there an official time frame?
Well, I mean, I think it really came to a screeching halt last February and early March. Okay. Now, there was a little bit of a hangover that carried over, and we didn't really start firing up the rain here east of the mountains until April. Mm-hmm. And then when we got into May, June, July, I mean, those times were very wet times across, southeast Wyoming, western Nebraska, down into Colorado. And then about that time, we saw a rapid transition from the La Nina to an El Nino. Okay. Now, when you look at the water temperatures off the west coast of South America, those things have been warm for a while now. But it's not just about that warm water. That warm water has to sit there enough to let the atmosphere, quote unquote, couple to it and really respond to where you get the desired and the preferred outcome, if you will, of what an El Nino is all about as far as the weather patterns are concerned. So we've been in the process of doing that now for a while. So when we head into this fall and into the winter, the atmosphere and the ocean are working together, and that's what you will see, some El Nino weather patterns take shape, no doubt.
Gotcha. So we're in El Nino now, and there was a transition period between the end of like February, March, when La Nina ended until the El Nino.
Until basically now. Now those warmer than average water out there in the Pacific, they also help to facilitate change. So this is, I prefer not to see La Nina or El Nino. I don't want those things because, and especially the stronger types, because if you get a strong La Nina or a strong El Nino, it has a tendency to lock weather patterns in place and reinforce themselves for an extended period of time. And those periods of time can last for weeks or months, and the extremes of those types of patterns usually don't benefit everybody. You go from a lot of rain and snow in one place to nothing in another. Case in point, this year, a lot of folks in Texas and eastern New Mexico, southern Oklahoma, even southern southeast Kansas are like, yay, El Nino's here. And I'm like, look, you got to be ready for some things that don't necessarily play by the book when you're dealing with that, because a lot of times we won't see El Nino episodes in the spring and summer. They come on late in the summer, they max out in the wintertime, and they taper off during the spring. So if you get something that's a little bit out of phase with what it normally is, it can produce some things that you typically don't see. Case in point, the crazy heat that we've been seeing across the midsection of the country. There are some folks that down in West Texas are saying this is worse than 2011 and 2012 down there, just simply because it's been so hot. Now, those folks, if you look at the drought monitor, you might say, well, they're not in a drought. Well, keep in mind the drought monitor is cumulative over a period of time, and those places in eastern New Mexico and West Texas, they had a ton of rain down there in May. Like, there were some places had like 20, 25 inches of rain down there in just a month and a half period of time. So I think we all have to be mindful of just these types of things. I've seen so many blanket statements out there about what this could mean or not mean, and I think it's very wise to be measured about that kind of a thing when you approach it.
And what do you mean by that? Just, not take the buzzword and apply that like it has in the past.
That's right. And I think this year, and by this year I mean this upcoming PRF season as we head into 24, I think it's important to realize that the stronger the El Nino we see, the farther south it typically produces or pushes the storm track.
I thought about that.
Yeah. So whenever we have an El Nino, I always want to see something that's a much more moderate event.
Okay.
I don't want to see necessarily a weak event because then the storm track ends up a little bit too far north and you leave the south out. I want to see something that's more moderate. Well, I don't think we're going to see a moderate event, unfortunately. I think the water temperatures that are out there right now are going to continue to be reinforced going forward, and by reinforced, I mean they're going to be quite a bit warmer than average.
Sure.
And they're going to persist for a while. So I would expect when everything starts to work here with the seasonal change, and as we head through the winter, I would now. You go just to the north, and like I said, you may go from something that's very wet to not much. Sure. So I think for folks if you're being talked to in southern Wyoming or Colorado or Utah or northern Kansas, southern Nebraska, and they might say, oh, it's going to be an El Nino, so we don't have to worry about PRF this year. I would really pump the brakes on something like that.
Sure.
And look at the situation and say, look, with PRF, I may not be loading up my intervals like I typically would if I thought it was going to be dry, or I may not just be shoving them completely aside if I thought it was going to be a wet. Maybe stretch that stuff out during the course of the year a little bit, so you're covered in one way, shape, or form. If you don't get what you thought you were going to get, or you do get something that you didn't think you were going to get. Yeah. And so if I was talking to someone, say in South Central Texas, probably not going to be telling them that because they're probably going to be lighting things up down there with the storm track. But if I was in Sterling, Colorado, might be talking about something different.
Yeah. And that's the nice thing about the policy, the flexibility that it offers. And so we're definitely excited to get out and show producers those options. So let's talk PDO.
Yeah.
And that's my understanding, kind of a more foundational type of weather pattern or trend that these La Ninas, El Ninos kind of are generated from. Right. And so where has that changed from last fall? Or
so it is negative, which is in a cold phase. Even with the El Nino that's going on, it's still saying negative. Now, will it moderate?
It's not as negative as it was.
It's still pretty negative. Now, when we in last month the value was down to a negative 2.5. Okay, so last fall we were down about -3, and then in January we came up to about -1.6, and then we went right back down.
Interesting.
So it's interesting to see these patterns because you would think if the whole state of the Pacific is warming up, then the PDO is going to. It will moderate. Will we have a complete phase shift going forward? It's tough to say right now. I figured by now, if we were going to have that full-on phase shift, and I'm not talking like a 30-year type phase shift, because I'm talking like a little bump in the road here where we could, briefly turn warm. I would have thought we would have seen a more of a response from the Pacific than what we've seen so far. So the thing to keep in mind here is that, okay, for some folks, great, we're in El Nino, that can mean wet going forward.
Sure.
For other folks who might say, well, but if the PDO stays negative, what does that mean for me next year? Well, if the PDO is negative, that makes it just that much easier to go back to La Nina.
Gotcha.
Okay. Typically speaking, when the PDO is cold, you have more frequent and longer lasting La Ninas. Case in point, the triple dip La Nina we just saw. If the PDO is warm, we have more frequent and longer lasting El Ninos.
Right.
So I don't think we're seeing that full-on phase shift, which I've been telling some of the folks that I work for, including you, we have to be ready to go back because we will revert back to the dryness. Yeah. That's just the way it works. So it's part of that whole thing where, great, we're in El Nino, so we're supposed to see more moisture, but I need to be looking maybe a little bit further down the road.
That's a surprise to me. I'm glad we talked about that because I just assumed we're headed back to the positive phase of the PDO, but we're still not even positive yet.
No,
we're a ways from it.
That's right. We flipped in 98.
Okay.
So we've been doing this business now for 25 years. Okay. So your PDO fluctuates on the order of about every 25 to 35. So even if we just spitballed and said 30 years, just right down the middle, we're still looking at, a few more years of negative PDO over the long term. I'm not saying we can't have a little blurb where we briefly go positive. We saw that back in late 14, 15, early 16. But after that, we went right back down there. So those little blips, those little warm blips are usually pretty short-lived and don't represent the greater pattern of over a 30-year period.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's, so analog years are always interesting to look at, and it seems like 13 to 14 was a favorite analog time frame last fall.
Going forward.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, coming out of a La Nina cold and whatnot. So did that work for some areas? I think it probably did. Did that necessarily work for California, where we thought it was going to be drier? 100% no. Like it was 180 degrees in the opposite direction. Right. So that kind of piggybacks on what I was saying, that we have to be careful when we blanket that. Now, is it a good thing they got all the moisture they did in California? 100%. It helped replenish some reservoirs. In dealing with the drought conditions that they had out there, that's great. But I like to look more regionally when we're looking at this stuff. Case in point, the Pacific Northwest. You go up into Western Oregon, Western Washington right now, they're struggling up there. They got fires and they've had some problems. Meanwhile, you go just to the east, parts of Montana have been just fine. Yeah. So when I'm looking for regional weather patterns that are beneficial, I don't just like cherry picking a state here and then a state over here being completely different. Yeah. So for some analog years for this upcoming winter and this year, I think we have to look at, first of all, what type of El Nino we're going to see. And you think that's we're looking at a strong El Nino? Not just a strong one, okay. But the actual type. So there's three different types that we can look at. One of those is where you have the warmest water right off the west coast of South America. That's called an east-based or a traditional El Nino. I think that's the type of El Nino most people remember or are familiar with. If that warmer water shifts farther west, that changes our weather patterns. So if it shifts just a little farther west, you get what's called a hybrid. You still have warm water off the west coast of South America, but it's a little broader than what it might be. Your weather pattern's still pretty similar. Southern branch of the jet stream fires up across the southern tier of the country. Everything's wet down there, blah, blah, blah. Then the northern Rockies, Pacific Northwest, usually drier than average because they're not in the main storm track. Okay. But if you push that warmer than average bullseye even farther west, you get what's called a Modoki El Nino. And that's closer to the west coast of South America. No, that would be farther out in the Pacific. Okay. So that'd be more like a central. Right. My bad. Yeah. Farther. Right. Yeah. So we're talking Central Pacific based. Yeah. Okay. What that does historically is it puts a blocking ridge of high pressure just off the west coast of California. Yeah. The jet stream goes farther north, and you get the eastern 2/3 of the country that get cold and wet. Get hit. Right. The west. So So again, it goes to one of those things like, well, we're in an El Nino. Southern California is supposed to be wet, and it's like, well, it depends on what type of El Nino you have. I think if you have an east-based or even a hybrid, you're probably right. You're probably still going to be okay that the southern branch is going to prevail. But if you get a Modoki, that thing changes up things like nobody's business. Right now, I think the shot of the chances of us seeing this evolve into a Modoki El Nino are not high. Okay. I think the type of El Nino we're going to have is kind of a mix between the east-based traditional and more of a hybrid. So if I'm putting all my eggs in a basket to say where I think the wettest pattern is going to end up, I still think southern tier of the country looks pretty ripe for some pretty good storms this fall, winter, and even as we carry over into early 24. So the three kind of flavors of El Nino are east-based, hybrid, and Modoki. That's right. Okay. And when was the last time we had a Modoki? Seems like it's... Oh, it would have been, I think we dealt with stuff back in, was it 16, 17 maybe? I'd have to go back and look for sure. But even if we look back in 2009 or 10, those types of things, and usually Modokias are not strong, because what you do is where the water is warmer than average right now, right off the west coast of South America, that warm pool shifts west, and you get upwelling, cooling that water off the west coast. So the water temperatures off the west coast of South America are colder than average, but you go just west of there, and they're warmer. It's like just this warm pool that's in the Central Pacific. And so when we're looking at brands of El Niños, not only do we have to say, okay, well, what type of strength is it going to be? We have to be. You're never going to be sure, but you have to be as sure as you can get what type that El Niño is going to be. Because the last thing you want to do is look at it and say, oh, we're going to go be traditional, everything's going to be fine. Then you go to Modoki and it's just like, man, this is not what we thought was going to happen.
Interesting.
Computer models help us to determine that. Weather patterns that are going on right now help us determine that. The longer we see that big warm pool right off the west coast of South America prevail, the greater chances we have of seeing something east-based or traditional, which would be reflective of what we saw in 82, 83, 97, 98, those big, strong events. Those are the primary analog years that we would look for if we think that that's what's going to happen. And to be honest, those are some of the years that we're leaning toward right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all good stuff. I actually as I'm talking to producers, especially farther west, and talking about upcoming premiums that are coming their way. They're in every case are this is a lot better than the hay we had to buy a couple years last year and the year before. So it's nice to be able to pencil that out, and so we're, like I said, we're sitting here end of August. What are the major things you're going to be looking at the next couple months? Weather-wise,
how the El Niño's evolving. Okay, is it still staying east-based, or do we see anything shifting? Is it weakening or strengthening? Right now it looks like this event will probably max out during the heart of winter, and by heart I mean December, January. Okay, and then after January, we're a little split on what this is going to happen. If we look at some of the stuff that the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia is putting out, they're thinking that this could carry over even into the spring. But then you have to look at historics to say, well, it's pretty rare to see a strong El Niño the previous spring, especially if the PD warm up can. Since they're working against each other there. Okay, so but I think my core message, this in particular, this PRF season is you're going to need to look at what you're going to have throughout all of 24. Okay, so we're probably going to be influenced by El Niño early in 24, and maybe even to early spring. But what happens after that? Okay, if the PDO doesn't warm up, there's a real good shot that we lose that warm water out there in the Pacific, and we start heading back to La Nina. So if you look at that trend, you say, well, I may not need help up front, but I may need some help in the back part of 24. So I think that's something that needs to be top of mind with producers when they're looking at setting up those intervals. I think, that's just good common sense, but that's also just using the forensics we have at our disposal to say this is what we think can happen going forward.
You bet.
Yeah. And as I said, I really want folks to concentrate on being measured this year, because there's been so much hype about El Niño and what El Niño means, and there's so much blanket misinformation out there that I think you really need to say, well, this looks like what could happen for us. But as we go forward, we also need to be prepared for something that may not happen for us. So if you're not sure, if you're on the fence, as I said, maybe you spread things out a little bit. Maybe you do things a little bit later in the year, on and on. There are a variety of ways, as you said, with the flexibility of the policy that you can make that happen.
Yeah, an extreme response is probably not a good response.
Probably not. I mean,
either way.
And I got to be honest with you, even for some folks farther south, because if this El Nino gets real strong, well, maybe that storm track goes even farther south.
Even farther south.
Baja, South Texas, Gulf Coast, and then you go up into, say, from Lubbock to Amarillo, and you'll be like, well, it looked like we were going to get a bunch, and we got not much.
Yeah.
So I think those are the things that I'm looking at. Really, I watch this stuff daily, Aaron.
You bet.
And I know someone said, well, it doesn't change daily. It doesn't matter. There's always something you can be looking at, whether it's history or comparing things to what's happening now, to help make that forecast not only resonate more, but also be as accurate as possible.
Yeah. You bet. Well, the things that from our discussion that are highlights to me is that it's possible the El Nino could go even farther south, which is, that would be extreme, and maybe even miss some of those the weather missed some of those farther southern areas that were still negative PDO. That was a surprise. And then the different flavors of El Nino, that was interesting too. So we're going to be at AgRisk Advisors working with you the next, in 15, 20 days. We're going to do another update. It'll be a live event for folks that want to participate and even recorded. And then 2 others, one more middle of October and one more middle of November. So we're excited to proceed with that.
Yeah, I'm fired up about it too, and I would really encourage producers and clients of AgRisk to take advantage of those interactive meetings, because it's like you can ask anything you want and chime in. So if there's some things that you've been wondering about or you're on the fence, those are the times that you really need to come to the table with your list that you want to hash out and take advantage of the opportunity, because that's the reason why we're doing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time today to kind of set the stage for what we've got the next couple of months. It's going to go by fast.
Go by very fast.
And it seems like we're getting busier and busier every year. So thank you very much for your partnership, Brent.
My pleasure, Aaron, and looking forward to chatting with folks in the future.
Sounds good.
All right.
All right.